This course focuses on the idea of justice, and we begin with a well-known moral thought experiment. Imagine you are operating a trolley that is speeding along a track at around 60 miles per hour. Ahead of you on the track are 5 workers. You try to stop the trolley, but the brakes fail. You realize that if the trolley continues straight, it will strike the 5 workers and they will die. Assume you are completely certain of this outcome. Just as you feel there is no solution, you notice another track branching off to the right. On that side track there is only 1 worker. Your steering still works, meaning you can turn the trolley onto that alternate track. If you do, the trolley will hit the single worker and kill him, but the 5 workers on the main track will survive. This leads to our first moral question. What is the correct action? What would you personally do in this situation? If we were to take a vote, many people would say they would steer the trolley toward the side track, sacrificing the 1 person in order to save the 5. Only a small number would decide to stay on the main track. Why do most people choose to turn the trolley? The most common explanation is that saving 5 lives seems better than losing 5 when only 1 life could be lost instead. In other words, people often believe that minimizing the total number of deaths is the morally preferable outcome. Some people compare this kind of reasoning to real-world situations involving tragic choices. For instance, during the September 11th attacks, passengers on one hijacked airplane fought back against the hijackers. Their actions caused the plane to crash before reaching its intended target. Many people regard them as heroes because their actions prevented even greater loss of life. However, not everyone agrees with the idea that sacrificing 1 life for many is morally acceptable. Some individuals argue that thinking this way can lead to dangerous justifications. They fear it might support extreme actions like oppression, genocide, or totalitarian policies, where harming some people is defended as necessary for the greater good. To explore this issue further, consider a slightly different situation. In this version, you are not driving the trolley. Instead, you are standing on a bridge that overlooks the track. Once again, a trolley is speeding toward 5 workers, and its brakes do not function. Standing beside you on the bridge is a very large man leaning over the railing. If you were to push him onto the track, his body would stop the trolley before it reaches the workers. The 5 workers would survive, but the man would die. Now the question changes. Would you push him? Most people say they would not. This creates a puzzling result. In the first scenario, many people were willing to sacrifice 1 person to save 5. In this second case, the same principle seems to disappear. Why does pushing someone feel morally different from turning the trolley? One explanation is that pushing the man requires directly using another person as a tool to stop the trolley. In contrast, turning the trolley merely redirects a threat that already exists. Another explanation is that pushing someone involves a very personal and deliberate act of killing, while steering a vehicle feels more indirect. To examine the issue further, consider another example. Imagine you are a doctor working in an emergency room. 6 injured patients arrive after a terrible accident. 5 of them have moderate injuries and could survive with prompt treatment. The 6th patient is critically injured and would require your entire day of care. If you devote all your time to the severely injured patient, the other 5 will die. If you instead treat the 5 first, they will recover, but the critically injured patient will die. When asked what they would do, most people say the doctor should save the 5 patients. Now imagine a different medical scenario. You are a transplant surgeon with 5 patients who each need a different organ in order to live. One requires a heart, another a lung, another a kidney, another a liver, and the last a pancreas. Unfortunately, there are no donors available. Then you notice that a healthy person is in the hospital for a routine examination. If you were to take that person's organs, the individual would die, but the 5 patients could be saved. Almost everyone rejects this idea, even though it would also save 5 lives. This reveals something important about moral thinking. At first, many people support the idea that the morally correct action is the one that produces the best overall outcome. Saving 5 lives rather than 1 appears to support that reasoning. This approach is known as consequentialism, which judges actions based on their results. However, when people consider situations like pushing a man off a bridge or taking organs from an innocent patient, they often feel that certain actions are wrong regardless of the outcome. This second perspective emphasizes moral duties and rights rather than consequences. According to this view, some actions, such as deliberately killing an innocent person, are morally unacceptable even if they could produce better results. In the coming weeks, we will explore these two major ways of thinking about morality. The most famous version of consequentialist thinking is utilitarianism, associated with the philosopher Jeremy Bentham. Another influential approach emphasizes moral duties and was developed by Immanuel Kant. During the course, we will read works by several important thinkers, including Aristotle, John Locke, and John Stuart Mill. Alongside these readings, we will also discuss modern debates about equality, free speech, discrimination, military service, and marriage laws. The purpose of studying these philosophical ideas is not only to understand abstract theories but also to see how they influence real political and social issues. However, studying philosophy involves certain risks. One risk is personal. Philosophy challenges beliefs that we often take for granted. It asks us to reconsider assumptions that once seemed obvious. When familiar ideas are questioned, they may never feel quite the same again. There are also political risks. Some people believe that learning political philosophy automatically makes someone a better citizen. In reality, the process can initially create uncertainty and doubt before leading to deeper understanding. This concern about philosophy goes back to ancient Greece. The philosopher Socrates faced criticism for encouraging too much questioning. In the dialogue Gorgias, a character named Callicles argues that too much philosophical debate can distract people from practical success in life. Many people respond to difficult moral questions with skepticism. They conclude that these issues have no definite answers and that everyone simply holds personal opinions. Yet philosophers argue that skepticism cannot fully solve the problem, because in everyday life we constantly act as if some moral principles matter more than others. For this reason, the goal of studying justice and moral philosophy is not necessarily to reach final answers. Instead, it is to stimulate thoughtful reflection and reasoning. The aim of the course is to awaken our sense of inquiry and explore where careful thinking about morality and justice might lead. A favorable outcome can occur even if saving 5 lives requires sacrificing one. This leads us to contrast consequentialist moral reasoning with categorical moral reasoning. Over the next few days, we will explore one of the most influential forms of consequentialist moral philosophy: utilitarianism. Jeremy Bentham, the 18th century English political philosopher, was the first to clearly formulate utilitarian moral theory in a systematic way. Bentham's core idea is straightforward and morally intuitive. The right or just action is the one that maximizes utility. By utility, he meant the net balance of pleasure over pain, or happiness over suffering. He argued that since all humans are governed by 2 primary forces, pleasure and pain, and because we naturally seek the former and avoid the latter, morality should guide actions, whether personal or legislative, toward maximizing overall happiness. In other words, the morally correct course of action, individually or collectively, is the one that increases the total amount of happiness. Bentham's utilitarian approach is often summarized as the greatest good for the greatest number. To examine this principle in practice, let's consider a real historical event rather than a hypothetical scenario. The case of R. V. Dudley and Stevens, a 19th century British legal case frequently discussed in law schools. Here is the story. A newspaper account from the time described it as one of the most tragic sea disasters. The yacht Mignonette yacht sank in the South Atlantic, about 1,300 miles from the Cape. There were 4 people aboard: Dudley, the captain, Stevens, the first mate, and Brooks, a sailor, all described as men of exemplary character. The 4th was the cabin boy, Richard Parker, a 17-year-old orphan on his first long sea voyage, who went despite warnings from friends, hoping the journey would mature him. The ship was struck by a wave and sank. All 4 escaped in a lifeboat with only 2 cans of preserved turnips and no fresh water. For 3 days they went without food, then opened 1 can on the 4th day. The next day they caught a turtle, which, along with the remaining turnip can, sustained them for several days. Afterwards, They endured 8 days with neither food nor water. Imagine being in such a situation. By this point, Parker had become weak and ill after drinking seawater against the other's advice and appeared close to death. On the 19th day, Dudley suggested drawing lots so one person would die to save the rest. Brooks refused, either to avoid the risk or because of adherence to categorical moral rules, and no lottery was conducted. The following day, with no rescue in sight, Dudley directed Brooks to look away and signaled to Stevens that Parker should be killed. Dudley offered a prayer, informed Parker of his fate, and then killed him by stabbing the jugular with a penknife. Brooks, despite his previous objection, later joined in consuming the body. For 4 days, the 3 survivors subsisted on the boy's flesh and blood. Eventually they were rescued. Dudley recorded their rescue in his diary with understated language. On the 24th day, as we were having our breakfast, a ship appeared at last. They were picked up by a German ship, returned to Falmouth in England, and arrested. Brooks testified for the prosecution, while Dudley and Stevens claimed they acted out of necessity, arguing it was better that one person die so that 3 could survive. The prosecutor rejected this reasoning, insisting that murder is murder, and the trial proceeded. Imagine being a juror tasked with evaluating whether their actions were morally permissible. Some might vote not guilty, believing the act justifiable, while many would vote guilty, judging it morally wrong. Defenders argue that extreme necessity can mitigate moral culpability. They contend that in such dire circumstances, survival requires harsh decisions, and if the survivors later contribute positively to society, their actions could ultimately benefit many. Critics reject this view, asserting that no circumstance grants anyone the right to take another person's life, and doing so is inherently wrong. The discussion also considers consent. Would Parker's voluntary agreement to sacrifice himself make the action morally acceptable? Some argue that true moral consent, arising from the person's own initiative, might make the act permissible. Others disagree, noting that even voluntary consent would not guarantee moral justification, since there was no certainty of rescue, and the act of cannibalism itself is objectionable. Some participants argue that fairness, such as deciding who dies through a lottery, is morally significant. A lottery, with everyone's agreement, distributes risk equally rather than letting one person impose the value of their life over another's.